podcast is consciousness and consilience. So I'm very happy to have George here with me in the virtual studio. We're going to go on a journey together. So, George, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Spiral Inquiry?
All right, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, my name is George Gantz, and I've always been interested in the big questions of life and the universe, and started writing some thoughts about 10 years ago, and then a few years ago opened up a website and a blog called Spiral Inquiry. And the thinking there is that the journey of learning more and figuring out what may be true or what may not be true, and finding our way to a better way of living is really a spiral process involving, from my standpoint, science, faith, and philosophy. Philosophy is where we use our mind to try and get a grasp on the inner truths of both science and faith and bring it into our lives. And it is a spiral because we keep going around in circles, but hopefully we make a little progress every time we go around. So that's the genesis of Spiral Inquiry.
Nicely said. And so, to some listeners, I mean, only some, I would say that the inclusion of faith into that equation is something that may be abrasive to some. And I've come to the realization that it's not abrasive in any way whatsoever. I think there's aspects and offshoots of faith, especially if it leads to any kind of a dogmatic tendency that can be dangerous. But there's also an aspect of that I realize is a function of culture. So it somewhat has a way of working itself out. And what are your thoughts on that? Like that interaction between science and faith.
Yeah, that's a great question, Daniel, because it comes up a lot. You go back 100 years, and I think you'd find that most scientists were religious in their belief structure, and most religious people were ardent believers in science. So there wasn't the same divide potentially 100 years ago as there is today. So I think there's been a late 20th century phenomenon that's really captured the culture in terms of talking about religion as a backwards way of thinking, superstitious way of addressing things, and really not grounded in the empirical studies that on which science is based. So there's been a divide that came up in the late 20th century, and obviously it hit some pretty big fireworks with the new atheists coming in and making very aggressive attacks on religion or spirituality or faith of any kind as unfounded and unreliable and superstitious. And what that failed to recognize is that there are key pieces of faith, key aspects of faith that are built into even the scientific process. For one, there's the faith that the regularities in nature that we observe are reliable and comprehensible. That's an article of faith. We don't have any way of proving that the laws of science are not going to change, that the laws of nature are going to change. But we have a faith that it's going to stay steady. We're going to be able to study it. We're going to be able to rely on what we find in science. So that's an article of faith that sits at the heart of science itself. And I think we have to be cognizant of that and be able to talk about the different kinds of articles of faith that enter into both the scientific enterprise as well as our daily lives.
Yeah, that makes me think about that. The door has no key that Penrose article that we started talking about in our first few interactions, and I think Penrose is quite a an influence on your writing and your thinking. Can you elaborate a little bit on Penrose and what he's meant for your intellectual journey?
Sure. I have great admiration for Roger Penrose, and one of my first introductions. So I studied mathematics in college. I have a degree in math, and just the insight that went into his discovery of Penrose tilings. These are the different types of repeating patterns of tiling that can be designed on a two-dimensional surface. And he basically proved that there was a very limited number of repeating tiling figures that can be structured. So it's quite imaginative. So that was my first introduction to him, but he has also continued to probe at the frontiers and kind of physics and consciousness over the years. Now I think he's 91, but he's still going strong. The particular kind of the theoretical framework that he posited in one of his books that I find very interesting is the idea that the reality in which we exist has three different aspects to it, or three different parts of it. So it's kind of like a three-part structure to reality. One is the physical world. That's the tangible physical world that we recognize and that scientists spend most of their time, talking about. Then there is the mathematical world. This is different from the physical world because it's really a set of abstractions, mathematical formula, mathematical truths, mathematical structures that are abstract from the physical world, but which have relevance to how we measure and how we calculate and how we look at the physical world. So, and this goes back, of course, to Plato, who talked about the Platonic solids, these perfect structures that from which the universe had to be constructed. So it's a Platonic idea that you have this world of forms, a world of mathematics, separate from the physical world. And then the third world that Penrose was talking about was the world of consciousness. And this, again, is something that has a relationship to the physical world in some way, and yet seems to extend beyond it into the mental world and the world of being aware of these other things. And he indicated that each of those worlds is related to the other in a way that's somewhat mysterious, and we really haven't been able to figure out. One is that the physical world seems to obey mathematical laws. So the structure and forms in the mathematical world seem to imprint themselves on the physical world. Another one of these mysteries is that the physical world somehow gives rise to the consciousness that enables the human mind to cogitate and look at and think about these things, including itself. And one of the features of the mind is that it is able to grasp the abstract structure of the mathematical world. So these three structures are different, but they are also interrelated in a very interesting and curious way. And he does say that, these aren't really three worlds, they're really part of one world, but we don't know how it all fits together. And some of those mysteries are still with us today. There was the essay by the great physicist Wigner in 1960, who talked about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. It seems to be the case that we can study the empirical world and use mathematical formulas, but we really don't know why it all works and why it all hangs together. So that's still an aspect of the big picture that we don't have an answer to yet.
Yeah. I've got maybe to change it and make it a little bit more plebeian. I've got I say we have, my wife and I, our family, we have two little puppies. Um, they're a couple years old, so I guess they're like, little teenage girls. But um, I quite often, uh, I quite often think about their cognitive processes and compare the consciousness of the animals that live in our house with I try and figure out what exactly is going on, and for me the work of Antonio Damasio really comes into play. I know we've talked about it before, but the idea that there's a sequence of events that happen from a felt experience or emoting is really fascinating to me, and I think you're very succinct in your summary about the fact that consciousness, our description of consciousness, really emerged from the ability to form abstract thoughts and then reason from those abstractions. So when I look at I'm not going to make this term in any kind of pejorative at all, but lesser forms, like say for example, a dog. Um, we just know as a matter of fact that the dog doesn't have that same ability to form abstractions, and the biological framework that I would point to, for a proof on that would be the expansion of the prefrontal cortex as a as a matter of our evolution, right? Um, so we have a physical framework to be able to say that our prefrontal cortex really accelerated in our pre-human forms, right? And so I want to pause there and say, is that I'm not saying anything that is in a disagreement. I think that's pretty much agreed on from your side as well, right, George?
Absolutely. Yeah. The interesting thing is there used to be I think, a very strong dogmatic view that only human beings were sentient creatures and self-aware and therefore and the only ones who could make distinctions between good and bad and right and wrong. And so the humans were the only entity on the world, the only animal that had that capability. They were therefore superior, and they also had a moral capacity or moral capability. So I think because that was consciousness. So even though some people said, well, yeah, it looks like animals can feel pain, but they really don't have the same, conscious capacities of us. So, we don't have to worry about it. Well, I think that's largely been resolved. And I think there's a general consensus that there are different levels of this conscious capacity that we exhibit. And yeah, dogs are conscious beings. They have feelings. They are social creatures, and even there's arguments about whether they can pass the test of looking at themselves in the mirror and recognizing that it's actually them in the mirror. I don't think dogs
Mhm.
pass that test, but there are other animals and birds that do pass that test. So we know they have some aspects of consciousness, and yet maybe not quite that self-awareness and that abstraction, the capability to make abstractions that humans have. And if you drill down a little bit and think about what those elements of consciousness are, it actually goes quite far down the chain of life.
Mhm.
I think some scientists have talked about even worms, planaria, will have some capacity of taking inputs from their external environments and then having reactions, making choices that seem to have at least some limited level of the conscious capacities that we talk about in the higher orders. So I think from that standpoint, it's safe to say that there's a continuum of conscious capabilities from the very lowest ability to process information, up to much higher capacities, and it gets more complex and sophisticated as you go. But I think we're moving in that direction in terms of our understanding of consciousness.
Now, let me know if you'd give me this. I think that sometimes our ontological frameworks or our category frameworks of higher order, lower order, can be somewhat limiting, especially as the epistemology, as the knowledge base continues to grow and fill in over time, right? So where I'm going with this is that although I agree with you almost 100%, there is an observation that I have with dogs, for example, that rely on smell, and so I think that their ability to make sensory maps based off their olfactory systems and their smell worlds, right, are quite fascinating. That's something that we just by our senses are very ignorant to, and evolution has kind of parsed that like an appendix out of our consciousness. We don't have that ability to take smell and really create a world with it. And I think that in this hierarchy of higher and lower order, that's fine because we see it that way. But and it definitely gives us a certain advantage, a definite advantage that we've actually forced and imposed on nature. But there's uniqueness to these animal creatures that surpasses our abilities in many cases, right? And the dog is just one example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that analogy because, I don't know what the numbers are, but I've heard, that a dog has a fine-tuned sense of smell that's hundreds of times stronger than humans. And you can see it. We have a dog that, we take care of every once in a while, my son's dog. And she's just sniffing all the time and, sniffing every little, and so they're able to develop, they probably have a cognitive map of the world based upon that sense that we really don't have a clue of. We are very, very visually oriented, and even the structures of the brain have evolved in such a way that it has accentuated for us the visual capacity. So we tend to be visual. And one of the interesting things about this is I think that makes us very sensitive to dimensions of space and time, and a little harder for us to grasp the dimensions of perceptual capacity that may be built into smells or even sounds in a way that other creatures probably have. It's just an interesting topic, really.
I want to talk about the truth function on this. Is a fascinating thing because our conversation can keep going in so many different directions. But on the nature of truth, with an emphasis on nature, I watch the dog on how it follows a scent. And I like to draw an analogy to how we pursue truth. Okay. And this can be a little bit pretentious, but I'm just observing a dog and how it can follow a scent with its nose off the ground by just an inch, or just it's amazing. There's no way I could run with my nose so close to the ground over hills and all. It's quite amazing, the machinery and the, the ability that dog has. And just an added point, there's certain dogs, hounds, for example, that have the ears that kind of cup and can capture that smell in a in a, like right in the forefront of where they're actually moving, which is just fascinating. If we study how the process of that smell integrates into the olfactory system for the
dog. I also love the way dogs are so invested in that when they've got a smell, when they're on the scent. They're so invested, and they're so just they're joyful. They're going after that in a way that the analogy is, when we see a beautiful visual cascade or something that we really like, we have that same sort of emotional cascade that a dog will have in this whole other field. And that's an area where we share a lot in our emotive capacities and the hormones that flow through our bodies. We share a lot with dogs, and that's one of the reasons humans and dogs can get along so well together. We've got a very similarities in terms of our social structures and what we like and what we don't like, and so we're able to get along really well with dogs.
Yeah, so the idea of that truth, I want to spend some time on this, because the function, the truth function, if I draw an analogy towards how a dog's chasing down a smell, you watch and it goes this way and it realizes that the smell's not quite there, so it goes over here, then it overshoots and it comes back, so it's like moving back and forth like this.
Yeah.
And I draw some similarities to how we pursue truth in a way, especially if it's not known, right? So there's the truths that we know, whether or not we say that they manifest as facts only. This is a whole separate conversation, because there's probably a nuance to the facts that we don't necessarily capture, that can be spatial, temporal. I mean, this is the conversation for philosophers, which, I don't want to derail the conversation, but you can see I'm drawing the analogy here between how truth functions for us when we're on that road to discovery, right? And we can look at it in a proximal and distal framework, when we look at it as an epistemology for all of humankind, or we just look at it as more or less like a pedagogical sort of framework where we're trying to learn something. Right? It's, you go one way, that starts to be a little erroneous. You go the other way, and you kind of keep coming back to something that tests and is predictable and, meets the standards of ethical falsification. That might be a really contentious thing, but I think that's one of the bridges between between faith is the fact that we have this ability to abstract, and then it's somewhat up to us to what we actually abstract, because we have this ability to create these stories. So what kinds of worlds, and this is revealing here, this is why I keep coming to Plato, is that we can inhabit these worlds, right? And that's why I keep coming back to Plato, is because of the abstractness that we can inhabit, make manifest, and then move to a proof, right? This is just absolutely fascinating to me.
So I love the analogy. I just love the analogy of, dogs on the scent. It's like philosophers, trying to sniff their way in the direction of the truth. So I think that's a pretty funny, calling philosophers a bunch of dogs, I think, is probably a useful way of reminding us all that we need to be humble as we approach our quest for truth. The word truth is a funny one, and odd, because it, in some sense, from the philosophical standpoint, that I think truth is a goal, and from this using the standard of proof, which you mentioned, I think truth is an impossible goal, except in mathematics, where the axioms are defined and the terms are defined. There I think truth has an element of perfectedness to it that can be relied upon. But when we're dealing with the physical world and our understanding of the laws of nature, or we're dealing with human consciousness and ethical and moral questions, I don't think truth has that kind of perfection. I think it's a quest that we will always be on. And even in science, we may be able to get closer and closer and closer, but that end goal of the perfect capturing of truth is a very elusive thing. And I think we should be cautious about claiming that we have found the truth and have proven the truth. I think proof is a funny. It's not something I feel that we can necessarily definitively rely on when we're dealing with truths in the physical world or truths in the consciousness world.
Yeah, I don't know if either one of us are experts on an Eastern influence of philosophy. Are you? Do you have much background on an Eastern?
I'm not an expert in anything.
Yeah.
I'd like to think of, the old saying, "Jack of all trades, master of none," is appropriate for for a good generalist and somebody that tries to think about a lot of things. So it's hard to even frame a question, a proposition, without making distinctions that may fuzzy up the issue of truth. So, one of the big ones is the duality. I talked with Penrose. It's sort of like the three worlds. Well, that's an expansion of the two worlds of mind and matter that has bedeviled Western philosophy since Descartes, and actually goes back to the Greeks. And one of the threads of Eastern philosophy is to try and avoid the trap of dualism by positing, one single unified reality. So how do you talk about the truth of whether it's, is dualism true, or is the unity of all being true, or maybe it's one of those things where it's a both and, that you can look at it in certain ways with certain sets of categories and find a truth in the dualistic, materialistic mind-body split. You can find some useful information there, but you also see useful information in the concept of the oneness of things and the non-duality. And so how do you keep in your mind these two seemingly contradictory points of view, both of which have truth embedded in them? So it becomes pretty complicated, I think, risky to put something out there and say that this is emphatically true without a lot of qualifications.
Yeah, I really want to focus on that a little bit. It's a view that I hold, of suspending like a monism and then a pluralism. You can kind of go back to, and I always like to go back to the roots. And so it's something that even predates Christianity. For example, in our Western tradition, if we look at a Heraclitus versus Parmenides tradition, I think it's great. And doesn't it the interaction between those two schools of thought and all the subsequent disseminations and elaborations throughout history, doesn't that inform what it means to be human and what that knowledge structure actually means? And so when someone comes and says this is like this is the way, right? Whether it's a Leibnizian monism or whatever, it doesn't mean that view is not important, especially as an academic or a Newtonian giant, for example. But I look at it more from a holistic standpoint, which essentially has a lot of roots in an ancient Greek sort of tradition. That it's these multiple counterfactuals that really come together in a pluralism of sorts that really inform human history and thought and epistemology. So I think it's all valuable, and the distinction here is to say it doesn't reduce to relativism, right? Because relativism is just a complete dilution. And if we make a somewhat like an org chart, or like a structure, we can see that there are a finite number of analogies and metaphors that map onto the way reality is, each of which can shade a bit of an understanding as to how the world is around us. And I think that's a very valid pursuit, as opposed to our quest for what someone like George Steiner said in his title, the quest for the absolute, right? Like, what is this perversion that we have to have this absolute universal truth? And I think that there is instances where that makes sense, like um, a Pythagorean theorem of the triangle, for example. Like, there are some universal truths, right? But then there's also understanding that informs complexity and chaos. So I think that's also important to distinguish.
Yeah, and that's one of the key differences I see in between these three worlds. If we use that as a metaphor for talking about, in the mathematical world, you can understand what truth means and you can prove it. There's logical proofs that you go through, and so that has an absolute certainty to it, a beauty to it. It's why the Pythagoreans worshipped the mathematics, because it had that perfection to it. But there was the interesting story about what happened when they realized, and they knew this in the whatever the believers were, the group of believers were, that they believed that all of these geometrical forms were perfectly consonant with the numerical forms in the number system. And when they were unable to find a rational number that could tell you what the hypotenuse was of an equilateral triangle,
Yeah.
because we now call that an irrational number. Well, back
Yeah.
then it was, everything was rational. They were trying to believe it was perfect. But then they found this incommensurability between the hypotenuse and a rational number. And one of the stories is that the fellow that proved that it was incommensurable was so unpopular that they threw him off of the ship and he drowned at sea. So having to grasp first of all, mathematics is subject to proof, but you will find incommensurables, and then you have to figure your way around it. But in the other spheres of the world, we don't have the ability to make those kinds of proofs, because everything is subject to the possibility of being just confirmed by a later fact. This again goes back to the why the regularities we observe in nature. You can say these regularities are sufficient and we've proven the mathematics of it, so we can believe in this particular regularity as a truth. The sun rises every day is an example. But the moment you come up with a single counterfactual, that statement can be proved to be not true in all cases. And then you're back to the square of not actually being able to claim something as an absolute truth when you're dealing with empirical science. And this was one of the points that David Hume made, and was very influential in my own philosophical development.
Interesting. I want to clarify for any present or future audience members that would watch this, that I've had a little bit of a pushback with the use of counterfactual. And I actually, I love using that word. I discovered, or really started to emphasize, using counterfactual after reading Jadeo Pearl's book. And Jadeo Pearl is, I believe, well, he works in the field of artificial intelligence, and developing systems around which he uses the word counterfactual. And so, to clarify, I like to use that word for different thought vectors. And do you know where I'm going with this, George? Like,
not yet, Daniel.
Okay,
I have to say, you know a lot more philosophy than I do. I actually do some muddling around in the mud puddle a lot, but you actually know a lot more philosophy than I do. So I want to hear what you can elaborate here.
Well, I've stumbled some. I've it's been a point of apprehension when I use the word counterfactual, because essentially I'm making a point, and I could say that there's a thread of thought, or a logical sequence of thought that from logic, so it has kind of a sequence to it, and then I can take another a premise or assertion and then move it in a different direction, right? And so I'm not so, and I think we can suspend those multiple versions of counterfactuals, and then objectively look at these types of things. And if we're really looking at something that mimics the way humans think and how our minds operate, we do have that ability to think in multiple vectors of thought, right? And when I'm not sure who said it, might have been something like a quote from Albert Einstein or something, but he was describing, I think one of the characteristics of a genius or a mind is that you can actually have multiple perspectives and use them as working models, as opposed to just a single linear type of interpretation. And I think that's really important. And so if it transcends time and it transcends space in a way, I think this is the beginning substrate for anything that is consilient, right? It's like, let's really pause and try and listen to what George is saying and what Daniel is saying, and see where the similarities are, right? And I think that's the first step to being able to work out a consilience of sorts, so a coming together, or as I think William Whewell had originally thought of, as a jumping together, right, of these two bodies of knowledge. Um, so yeah, I think that's the important next move, is to make sure that we're in fact, I'll elaborate a little bit on the philosophy side of things. I came up with this idea and this model called a hermeneutic mean. Okay, so we both know who Richard Dawkins is, and he kind of won the war on the individual unit of culture, right? And so that was described and accepted in academia as a mean, replicating individual unit of culture. And I came up with the concept, a hermeneutic meme, and I meant that it's an individual unit of understanding, and so it's much more of a variable uh, node, right? So you can bring in different things into this node, and how they're synthesized. It's just like a variable. It is how I frame that one. So I think that's really fascinating, and I'm wondering that when we take this corpus of influential scientific thinkers, where does your mind go, George, when it goes to like a theological type of thing? Like, who would be your influences? Because I honestly can't really sit, and nothing really comes to mind to say who am I influenced by from a religious side of things, right? Like, how do you like what do you draw from?
Uh, well, that's a good question. I think I had a significant series of reawakenings for me when I was in my late 30s and 40s. When I was in college studying mathematics and logic and philosophy, I was an adherent to a positivist mentality that, we were smart enough, we would, through logic and empirical studies, figure it all out. So there was the goal of the theory of everything that was going to pull it all together, and we would know all the truths of the natural world and the life we're living, and based upon logical premises. And I had some disappointments and disillusions in that process, and it would take a long time to go into the details. Maybe we'll do it at a later point. We can talk about that. But that disillusionment left me feeling empty. And the word I like to use is vastation. When things are emptied out. So that belief structure had been emptied out, and I made the decision that I was never going to figure out the meaning of life by going, studying more philosophy. I had to go live some life. So I went and lived life, got a job, got a car, got a mortgage, got married, got a couple of kids, lived through a divorce. A lot of stuff happened. And in that process, I began to reevaluate it's kind of the basis of my view of the world and my view of life, and knew there was something missing. I came out of a Christian tradition and met a fabulous woman that's now my wife of 28 years. And she grew up in a small religious community that was based upon the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a 17th century philosopher, scientist, seer. He was one of these, like a Da Vinci, type, or a Plato type, in all spheres. And his theological approach, which was the last half of his life, was his theological writings, these massive volumes of books, had within it threads about a kind of universalism in terms of the way we look at life, the way we look at science, the way we look at Christianity in particular. And that was a strong influence in reawakening me to what we might call the spiritual aspects of the human experience, the things that the mystics have talked about forever, and we can be very uncomfortable talking about, because those influences have led humans of different parts of the world to embrace different religious traditions, and sometimes there's lots of conflict that happens between those humans. So, but it gave me an opportunity to rethink what the spiritual side of our human experience really meant, and then how do we integrate that with the physical, empirical side of our experience. So that for me is a consilience, because I see, if you really think about, say, the metaphysical consequences and implications of what science like quantum physics and cosmology and Big Bang, if you look at the metaphysical implications of some of that stuff, or emergence and life, it gives you the same messages that the fundamental core principles of most of the major religions have given us about how you live a better life with loving creation, loving each other, embracing what has been given to you, and make the most of it. These are all fundamental, universal kind of human principles. And if you can bring that and you bring the empirical science together, it's all telling us the same stuff. So let's pay attention to it, knowing that we don't have the bead on the truth. It's a journey of discovery, and we are better off the more people we can join in that journey with. So it's a collaborative spiral process. So there you
go. Spiral. There it is. The spiral. It comes right back into it always. Yeah, it's great. George, I know we've got about 9 minutes left, and I want to throw a curveball your way. I'm going to focus a little bit on the fact that you've got a background as a mathematician. Okay, so there's the warm up. It's where you can see, what is he doing? What is he gonna? I'm going to throw this at you. Okay, and I want you to give. I'm not going to elaborate too much, but what I'm going to do is give me your thoughts on a task that I would ask you to help me with. Okay, so I've been working on conceptually trying to flush out an idea about defining Euclid's point. Okay, so adding a dimension to Euclid's point. Now, this might be a little bit of a head scratcher there, right? Because in terms of looking at Euclid's concepts, his fundamental starting point is essentially the point. And there's an assumption with the point that it is breadthless, right? It doesn't have a dimension. And I thought of this. This came to me, I think, in 2016. I was fleshing out an idea. In fact, I was actually reading one of Leonard Mladenov's books on Euclid, and I started to come up with defining the width of the Euclidean point by the Planck length. Okay,
Hmm.
so the dimension of the Planck length, which is so almost inconceivable. It's 100% theoretical, right? Because it's like you could take the size of an atom, right, which is just so small, and then you could take the size of the Planck length, which is like all the observable universe inside of the atom. So it's so hard to to conceptualize or falsify or do any sort of predictive analysis on. But I think I want to pause it there because there's. Are you interested in delving and rolling up your
Oh,
intellectual and mathematical sleeves?
oh yeah. Oh
Really?
yeah.
Okay, good.
So this is go back to the three worlds: math, physics, and consciousness. Um, uh, this is a distinction between the physical world and the mathematical world. In the mathematical world, the Euclidean point has no dimension. And it is what one could say, well, it's an imagination of nothing, the physical point. I mean, it's something, but it's nothing. And in the physical world, we understand now from quantum physics and the uncertainty principle that the activity in the physical world is quantized, and the smallest unit of space is Planck space, and the smallest unit of time is Planck time. And any effort to try and go underneath that or beyond that in terms of our reductionist tendency to pull stuff apart, we like to pull stuff apart, can't be pulled apart. So the universe, the physical universe, is actually comprised of a finite set of almost very small but still finite sized pieces of space and time. So it's like pixelated. You imagine the universe is
Yeah.
pixelated in that sense. It doesn't. That's not what mathematics is. Mathematics is not pixelated because it is a continuum. So this is a huge issue because for me, in the mathematical world, you can conceptually play with things like nothing and infinity
Mhm.
and the limit as we take the expression 1 over x, and x goes to infinity. We know that formula will go to 0. But those are limits. Those are infinite processes that continue forever. And those have very, very special conceptual powers and requirements. But in the physical world, if we look at what the physicists are saying, it is quantized, it is finitized. And the difference between infinite mathematics and finite mathematics is a very, very contentious issue between the physical sciences and math. And there are a lot of physicists that will talk about, infinite multiverses as if that's something you could actually wrap your mind around or the physical world could be based in. It looks to some that the physical world is actually finitized in the way because of quantum physics. And so you've got this two very different worlds. You've got the physical world finitized, you've got the mathematical world, which can be infinite and infinitely divisible. So I think that's one of those mysteries between how the three worlds operate. So I think it's a big one. It's a good question.
Yeah, so I mean, on that regard, I think that's a perfect summary. We've talked a little bit about Max Planck and the idea of the Planck length, the Planck time. That's really one of the incipient inspirations for planksip as an organic platform, right? So there's a lot of those types of things, and we did a whole bunch of spiraling into several forms of inquiry, didn't we? So I think that's a good point to leave it off as the introductory episode. And let's pick it up next Monday, and onward and upward, sideways and inside out is the way we like to go. And I look
That's
forward
great.
to this journey with you, George.
Daniel, just thank you for provoking this conversation and pulling it together. It's very exciting and just a lot of fun. It was great
Awesome.
talking.
Okay, bye now.
Bye bye.